Hey everyone, it's very strange not being able to see anyone, but I totally get that. I'm just gonna first of all just introduce myself, and then I'll kind of go briefly over a few of the things that we'll do. Um, so I'm a professional photographer. Primarily my bread and butter is restaurants and food photography and things like that. But my kind of passion and personal work is all film photography, fine art photography, and that whole process. And I've been kind of dipping in and out of it for the last maybe 7-8 years. So I thought what probably the best, I actually put out a thing on my Instagram and asked people that were beginning what sort of things would be interesting to learn about and information that would be useful as a beginner. And I remember the sort of things that I would have found useful when I started. So this is kind of just adding to that. So without further ado, I think that probably the best place to start with film photography especially is cameras and camera types. So I've got the chat open here, so if I'm just chatting, just type anything in that you may want to ask as we go along, and then I'll kind of do some more questions at the end for more specific things, but feel free just to jump in and I can try and do it as we go along. So what most people will probably be familiar with as far as film photography is concerned is a camera like this. This is a 35mm camera, and this refers to the 35mm refers to the size of the negative, not the lens, which is what I used to think quite often. However, this is a 35mm film camera, which is an SLR. So if you ever see an SLR, you are quite often, if it's a digital camera, you'll see a DSLR, which stands for digital. And SLR is a single lens reflex camera, which essentially means that to look through the camera, you're looking through a mirror, right? So there's a mirror in there. If I wind it, you'll see, give me a second, you'll see the mirror going up and down, see? And that's what you're looking through. So you're looking through the prism here, and then that mirror is reflecting, and then that's how you're viewing your scene. Whereas there are other options. That's going to be a fiddly guy. Let's go. There are other options as far as film camera is concerned. Another one would be a rangefinder. So this is a rangefinder, a Leica rangefinder. And what this generally means is you aren't looking through the lens. So behind this lens is, I'll take the lens off, it's just a little dark slide essentially. There's no mirror. So you're not looking through the lens. You are looking through here, through a patch. And essentially what that means is that you within that patch, you'll have frame lines, which will show you essentially your composition, what it's going to look like, but you're not looking directly through the lens, and you are focusing. Unlike with an SLR camera, you have like a kind of either micro prisms, which is loads of little pins that essentially, once they're in focus, they'll all become clear, or you have a kind of a split prism focus, which is where eventually they'll slide in and then they'll meet in the middle. With a rangefinder, you've got two patches, and those two patches will eventually slide along and they'll meet in the middle. So those are your two kind of like standard style of cameras. Rangefinders are traditionally used quite often for like street photography and things like that, because you will do zone focusing, which is where you'll find on your lens, it will quite often have feet, as in like the distance. So you'll kind of slot in your distance, and then you'll set it, and then you can basically shoot from the hip. Very difficult to do in an SLR camera. It's also very fast to focus with a rangefinder. So that's your kind of basics with that. I thought the next thing that would probably be useful to jump in on is, hello guys, how are you doing? Your two options would be, so you've got a 35mm film camera, so that takes your 35mm negatives, and then you've got something like this, which is a medium format camera. And in a second, I'll show you the difference between the negatives so you get an idea. Medium format camera used to be like very much a professional camera. So until like Hasselblad started making cameras that are a bit more for the kind of commercial market. These are much higher resolution when you scan them in compared to your kind of 35mm negative, and I'll show you why that is. This, if you're wondering, is also a rangefinder. You're looking through the patch here, not through the lens, and that's just the style of camera. But to give you an idea on the differences between them, because it all just sounds like numbers and names and things like that, is I'll grab a negative from each of these things and you can see the difference in size, because that is, you can get an understanding of why it is that people are using these for professional kind of large scale work. 2 seconds, fiddly. So this here, I've chosen a very bad one because this is on flash, so it's all very light, is a 35mm negative, okay? And then between 35 and medium format, like full size 6x7, you have 645, which is slightly bigger. It's double the size. So you can see there's the picture here, and that's double the size. And then after that, you have 6x7. This is medium format. So if you can see how much bigger, trying to show you the best way of seeing it, how much bigger this negative is. And that one frame is this here. So you can imagine how much more detail you're going to get in that. So to give you a quick rundown of those sizes, you will have 35mm. And again, this is referring to the negative size, not anything to do with lenses. You have 35mm, 645, which is somewhere between the two. And then you'll have 6x6, which is square, 6x7, which is this one here. And then you go into large format. So large format will go up 4x5, 5x7, 8x10, and just big. So they're like sheets, like this big. And that's what you kind of get, or your kind of classic American photographers like Stephen Shaw and people using big, large format cameras. And it's from those, I mean, the equivalent of say to a megapixel is colossal. It blows them out of the water, to be fair. Oh, kind of like a pinhole. Have I missed that question completely? Oh, kind of like a pinhole. I think they're called cameras. Which one was kind of like a pinhole camera? Sorry, go for it. I'm here to listen. The second one you said. Oh, what the Leica? So a pinhole camera is essentially just a very, no, not the one where you're looking direct. Oh, yeah, to a degree. This is I haven't in a way, sort of, but along that kind of line, the frame lines are within the patch, so you can still, you know, you can still shoot the same, and everything will essentially look the same. But the benefit of it is that you have frame lines, so you can see everything that's going to be coming in and out. It's a love-hate relationship. Some people really don't like using them, and some people really do like using them. So I would always much prefer have a rangefinder now that I've been using them. But I quite often see that people, you know, I want to get a Leica because there's this hype about these cameras. But the reality is that if you've never used a rangefinder, I probably would try and use one before, you know, you jump in and try and buy a Leica, because you might not enjoy the way it shoots, because it is a completely different way of taking a photo. Yeah. So what I would say though is, where is it? With medium format, I think medium format, this here is, this is my workhorse. This is what I use for pretty much everything, all of my major work. I could print a scan from this straight off the bat to like A2 just from this negative. And cameras you may have heard of that are medium format. So you've got Pentax 6x7, 6x7 II, the Mamiya RZ67, the Mamiya RB67. These are all kind of your classic medium format cameras. But then between the two, before I got into medium format, I had a Mamiya 645, which is a kind of more affordable and well, affordable because it's cheaper camera than buying a proper big medium format camera, but it's also better value because on a negative, so on a 35mm negative, you have 36 exposures or 24. On a 6x7 120, I can actually show you a roll of it quickly. Here we go. So it looks like this. Take it out of that so I can put it straight back in. This is how it comes. You could shoot 10 photos on this. So not very many, unless you're shooting 6x6, and I think it's 12. Or you're shooting 6x5 and you can take 15. And again, the negatives are much bigger than 35mm. So you get a lot more for your money. So I think it's a good thing to bear in mind. Medium format is great to shoot, but it is expensive, not only in cameras, but also it is expensive as far as what you get out of it, how many photos you can take. So I think what I will do is I'm going to jump into some of the, so I'm going to imagine that nobody knows anything. I think that's probably the easiest way, then everybody can, you can just ask questions as I go along. So I'll use this one to go through for a basic understanding, because this is a Nikon FM2. It's a fully manual camera, so it has no auto mode or anything like that. So there's no aperture priority or anything along those lines. So I'm just going to talk manual. So classic manual cameras that you guys may look at is it's a great camera. It's very, very good. Is like a Pentax K1000 or something like that. Won't really break. Doesn't matter if the light, doesn't need a battery for the light meter to work. Doesn't need a battery for the shutter to release, which means that you can pretty much use it as you go along. It doesn't matter if you're it's only doing the light meter. So I'll go through the basics quickly, starting with shutter speed. So on the top, you'll have your shutter speed, and this is a crazy camera, so it goes up to 1/4000th of a second. That's not very normal. Usually most cameras will go up to like 1000, but this has got a titanium shutter or something like that, so it goes really quick. Not necessary. I'll very rarely use a shutter speed with that speed. And essentially that's just saying about how long your shutter is going to be open for. Okay, so if we take the front off again, we'll start at B. So B means bulb, and that is if you want to do long exposures or something like that at night, you will plug a shutter release cable in here, and you can hold it open and expose the negative for as long as you like. And you will, and that's good for low light situations on a tripod and things like that. So then you'll jump up to 1 second. You can, yeah. So obviously 15th second, 30th second, 60, 125, 250. The common kind of understanding is that on a camera like this, you don't want to shoot it handheld below 60th of a second. And essentially that is because at 60th of a second, you still have the potential of, shaking. And if you shake, then the photo is going to be blurry. So especially if you're using big medium format cameras, but however on a Leica or something like that, because it has no shutter and there's no mirror bashing it. So it's the mirror bashing that's going to make it shake. If you don't have that mirror, and it's like, or you got leaf shutter, you don't have to worry about that so much. But if you're going to be shooting handheld, I would look into just using anything above 60th of a second. So shutter speed is super important because you need to really be thinking about your scene and what it is you're going to be capturing. And that's why shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are a balancing act. One affects the other, and so on. So if you are say if you want to capture motion on a street, so you've got your camera on a tripod and you focused it into the street and you want to get like blurry cars, let's say, during the day, you want to have your camera at a slow shutter speed so that anything that you've been focused in that isn't moving is going to stay pin sharp, but anything that's moving is going to be a lovely blur across the thing. Not really possible if you're doing it handheld, but on a tripod, perfect. And you'll get lovely motion blur across and everything else will be tack sharp. Whereas if you're taking a photo of, let's say, a wave and it's splashing against a rock, you want that number to be as high as possible. And that means that it's going to be super sharp. So if you hear this difference in speed for 60 per second, quite slow. And then if I jump it up to 4,000, it's that's going to make it kind of capture that really snappy kind of stop motion. If you don't have it that quick, you're just not going to stop the motion, and you'll have a little bit of motion blur. But it's not, as I said, I would never ever shoot at 4,000 per second, so I wouldn't worry too much. Moving on to aperture. So aperture is one of these things that I think, for when I started, sounded much more confusing than it actually was. So someone once taught me that if you want to take portraits, you use a low number, and if you want to take landscapes, use a high number, which is a pretty good way to explain it. But you need to understand what it is about aperture that is why those numbers are important. So if you imagine I don't think I'll be able to show you on here. Your aperture ring, okay, is essentially a small hole in which are blades, and those blades come together and they make different size holes. So a low number would mean a much larger hole, and then a higher number, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay. So the smaller it gets, the more light you need to let in at the shutter speed side. So that's what I mean by compensating. So with a lower number, that's when you're going to get your bokeh or your bokeh, where it's blurry in the background, a bit like your iPhone does for portrait mode. So anything, let's say f4 and lower, is going to make a nice blurry background. So if you're taking a portrait of somebody and you want to kind of have that separation, you want to kind of stick to that kind of area. Otherwise, you may lose that person within that kind of composition. So you kind of stick. This goes up to 1.4, and 1.4 is to the degree that I could take a photo holding up, I don't know, this Kodak, and everything would be completely out of focus. So you need to make a kind of stylistic choice of the sort of thing you're going for. Portraits, generally, you want to look for that nice kind of fall off straight behind them. So f4 and below is a good place to start. Whereas if you're taking photos of landscapes, you don't want to have a super shallow depth of field like that. You want everything to be in focus. So you need to be using a higher number. So f16 to f22, that sort of kind of playing field. Every lens has a sweet spot, and most lenses work better around f16 than they do f22 sharpness wise. So again, if you want everything in focus, you're nice, like not a flat image, but kind of details throughout that are all different distances away from you that are all in focus. Your plane of focus has got a lot wider. So you can now use that to make sure you're capturing that. You don't want to be shooting a landscape scene at 2.8. However, sometimes your light may not make that possible. So I'll jump into ISO and I'll get back to how the three of them, your exposure triangle, all relate to one another. So your ISO, which is also called ASA on some cameras, mine's up here, and you kind of spin. It's quite awkward to see. You can see it spins in there. That is how fast your film is. So the common misconception is if you change your ISO, it's not going to change anything that happens in the film camera. as in the film canister. Nothing will change. All this the ISO is doing is this reading to your light meter, and it's telling your light meter what film you're shooting, and then it's adjusting for that. So don't worry too much, especially with color film. If you have overexposed it, color film, I think with Portra 400, you can overexpose it by up to 6 stops. So that's a lot. It's a lot. So as far as overexposing and you're shooting color film, I primarily shoot color film. It's less lenient with black and white, but you're always safe if you overexpose. So if you're ever worried about that, just overexpose it. You can always save it. So ISO is important. So the higher the ISO, the more light that you're going to get into it. So if it was a really sunny, bright day, I could get away with shooting ISO 50, 160, or anything above. Whereas if it was a really, kind of dark, cloudy, moody day, I don't want to be shooting anything like Kodak Color Plus 200 or Portra 160 or Cinestill 50D, because that means to counter that, I'm going to have to open my aperture right up and make it that hole bigger to let more light in. And then it's already a losing battle. You've lost that stylistic choice. So it's always important to choose your ISO depending on what you're doing. So if you're going on holiday, whenever I go on holiday, I shoot quite a lot in Greece. I will always take Color Plus 200 because I know it's going to be super bright. But my majority of the film I use is Portra 400 because it's kind of like between everything. So you're pretty safe bet as far as that thing's concerned. So the reason why it's important that these will correlate. I always find that photography is like problem solving. And say I want to take a photo of somebody as a portrait, and it is a really bright day. I could go up. I'm going to take that photo. My light meter is saying that it's way overexposed if I'm shooting it wide open, because wide open is going to let a lot of light in. So if I'm shooting it at 2.8, it's going to let a lot of light in. So that means I need to make my shutter speed faster to counter that. So my aperture blade is really far open and letting loads of light in. And now I need to stop my shutter speed from opening for too long onto the negative, if that makes sense. So I need to make that really quick. So that my aperture is really wide. I'm going to go bam, really quick to make sure that I don't overexpose. As I said, you can overexpose. I wouldn't worry too much about that. But where it can be an issue is if you want to take a photo of a darker scene and you're going to have to bump. So you're taking a photo of a landscape and you've only got it handheld and it's quite dark and your meter is saying, so you're shooting it at f11, let's say, and it's too dark to be shooting it at 125. So you either need to grab a tripod or you're going to have to open it up. So it's just about making stylistic choices, if that makes sense. Making sure that, I think a lot of people sometimes forget is that you need to think about what it is you're trying to get out of the photo that you're making. So if you're just snapping away, that's fine. But it's good to get into the rhythm of thinking, what do I want to be in focus? What do I want not to be in focus? Am I looking for motion blur? Overexposing certain films makes certain films look different. Just really considering all of these different things is really important, which then takes me on to the thing that quite a lot of people find quite difficult, which is metering. So if your camera has a light meter, you've kind of either got one of the two, a center weighted meter or a spot meter. I understand this is a lot of information, so I hope people, I've only got an hour, so I hope people are taking notes because it's quite a lot. So a spot meter, essentially, when you look through your lens, it'll have usually if it's an SLR camera, so ones like this, Canon A1 program has a spot meter, that sort of thing. The center of it is where it's reading from. So if I was taking a photo right now of where I am, and my meter was pointing here, it would consider it dark. And if my meter was pointing here, it would consider it bright. And that's where a spot meter is good, because you quite often hear people saying, oh, I'll meter for the shadows, I'll meter for the highlights. So if you meter for the shadows, what that means is, when people say that, is that it's going to make this bright. So when you get the negative back, this isn't going to be dark anymore. It's going to be like this, which is good in some respects. But I found that I personally like to take a meter reading from here and a meter reading from here, and then I'll merge the two and I'll choose an average, which means that I kind of have nice dynamic range to play with. Some people will just meter for the highlights, which then would make this really dark. So like really contrasty, like when you see like black and white photos are really contrasty. A lot of people will meter for the highlights. So that's just the way you can do it. Center weighted is a bit more of like an, you've either got what it's like an average. So it's kind of around the center of the your focus ring. And it will create its own average from the space. But I don't want to get given too much information at once. So, but be sure if you want to stop me to ask me anything, guys, because I understand it's quite a lot of info. So what I thought I would jump into is quickly different types of film stock, because I think film stock is one of those things that you get a lot of hype film stocks and big big brand names and like kind of small funky things, and I think that it's just knowing about which one suits you best, that sort of thing. So first of all, you've either got positive film or you have slide film. It's the basic kind of thing. Slide film is a positive film, which is slide film, or you have negative film. So a positive slide film, that would be let's say like Ectar or Ektachrome. And essentially that just means that they are positive. So when you look at them, they look exactly as you will when you develop them. Famously, they're very, very hard to meter for because they have very little dynamic range. So with a normal, this is Portra 400, it has a lot of dynamic range, which means that your meter can be above and below, and you're still going to get a picture out of it that's pretty good. Whereas with Ektachrome, the dynamic range is so small that you have to be really accurate to be able to shoot it. So it is hard. It's also bloody expensive now. It costs about 15, 16 pounds a roll. So choosing that, I think a lot of landscape photographers use like things like Provia and things like that, which are positive films, and they are perfect for what that sort of thing is, like really punchy, saturated colors. Or you have negative film. And I think the issue is that with normal negative film, you can get it developed anywhere, still very expensive. Whereas positive film has a completely different process and can sometimes cost quite a bit more to develop it. As far as brands and things like that are concerned, why do people? I wouldn't say people prefer to shoot positive film. I would say that 2 seconds. I think it just depends what you're doing with it. So with positive film, as I said, a lot of people use it for landscapes, and because it is very saturated. So if you think about all the older, like Steve McCurry and people like that, they shot Kodachrome, which is a positive film. So it's famous for being really, really punchy, really nice reds, things like that. So, I mean, I've shot Ektachrome quite a lot and I really enjoyed it. It's just really expensive, really expensive. So I tend to stick to Portra 400, which is Kodak's professional standard film. However, that's because I shoot a lot of medium format film. However, with 35mm, I shoot a lot of Color Plus, Fuji C200, things like that. And they all kind of have different aesthetics. So Fuji's famous for like their greens, and Portrait's famous for its like yellows and warm tones, and kind of just being a flat kind of base to work off. So I think just search around, find things that work for you. Kodak Gold and things like that, they're really good entry-level films. Unfortunately, they have become very expensive. I think when I started shooting film, I started shooting in 2009, and I had my dad's old Pentax K1000 ME Super, and I used to go to Jessups and get my film developed. And it was going so downhill film that every time you took a film to get developed, they would give you a free one back. So I just had endless amounts of essentially just free film. So you only pay for development, but that doesn't exist anymore. So that's why I now develop at home, which is something I would advise anybody to get into. Actually, saves you a lot of money. So I develop at home. You don't need a dark room. That's not what developing is about. You need a dark space to load your film, but you can do it in a bag, just in a can. But I just do it in my kitchen over my sink. It's very boring, but it ends up costing, let's say, instead of £12 to develop a roll of film and get your scans, it costs about £1 a roll. And you can get from a box of 50 quid chemicals, you can get about 30 to 50 rolls of film done out of it, depending on how well you keep your chemicals. And then I scan at home. So again, that saves so much money. Even when I have no chemicals, I can just go and develop for 6 quid and then come and scan them at home myself, which saves a lot of money. So I definitely look into doing that. If that is something you wanted to save some money, you did want to shoot a lot, there's plenty of YouTube videos explaining it, and definitely worth looking at. I thought I would, rather than just talk about camera bodies, I thought it'd be good to talk about lenses and different options. So I think a lens that would normally come on a 35mm camera that you would buy would be a 50mm lens. 50mm is the equivalent of your eyes, your human eyes. So it's a really nice place to work from. I think it's a good place to have your first camera, is to be a 50mm. Then, if you wanted something potentially wider, this is a 35mm lens. So a 35mm will give you a lovely, not much wider, a significantly wider plane to work with for compositioning. Hopefully without any warp, depending on how good the lens is. And then obviously that keeps on going lower and lower and lower. So like 28mm, which is a lot of street photographers use. And then you go the other way for like 80mm or 100mm. And the difference mainly with those sort of lenses is the higher you get, the more compression is added. So, but what I mean by compression is, say if you have a 100mm lens, and you take a photo of somebody stood on top of the Empire State Building, and you've got the skyline behind them. If you're using a 35mm lens, you're taking a photo of that person and there's lots of space and the skyline's really far in the distance. And it's kind of nice and wide. If you're using a 100mm lens and you've got a photo of that person here, everything that's behind them is going to seem a lot closer. So it's going to be sat right behind them like this. And that's what people mean when they say compression. So it's compressing the image from the back to the front. So it's kind of squeezing itself in. So everything seems a lot tighter and compressed, which is really good for some things. Again, it's a stylistic choice that you make. So that's why a lot of people tend to use like 80mm lenses for doing portraits, things like that. But then confusingly, if you're shooting medium format, it says 80mm, but it's not actually 80mm, it's 50mm. And that's because it's the equivalent. And just because of the way medium format cameras are built, it's the equivalent of that. So good to check that. If you're buying a medium format camera, and it says 80mm, it will mean 50, and so on. 43 will mean 28, etc. What was that? Okay, cool. So what I thought I would do is I'm going to jump into editing something. So as I said, I scan all of my own films at home. This is really important. So I'm going to jump in and tell you this because I didn't do this when I was younger and I regret it. So store your film. I lost a lot of photos from when I was younger because I didn't store it. So this is by Hammer. So I usually have one for every year. Who is it? Kenro, these are this brand. So that's one for medium format, and then obviously that's 35mm, so and so. Keep them all in these because if you don't, you'll regret it one day because you won't be able to go back. So I used to think, I'll shoot film because it's great, and and then I won't have to worry about digital. And if I lose all my photos on Facebook and so, which has happened when I was younger, all the photos you put up on Facebook are all pixelated and horrible. But I didn't keep all of my negatives for a lot of them. I was lazy and didn't go back to Jessops and collect them. So just make sure you get all of them back and then store them and put them in binders, and then you can just forget about them. But one day you might need them again, and that's the best thing about it is you can just go back to that whenever. You could do a crappy edit and it doesn't matter because you can just go back, scan it again, and do it all from afresh. You'll have it forever. And that's something I didn't do, which I really regret. So as I said, I scan everything here in an Epson V550. And from a scan of a 35mm negative at home, I can probably print to, let's say, A3. And then with medium format, I can print up to like A2. So it does a pretty good job, to be honest. But if I wanted to print it much bigger than that, I could take it to a lab and then they can scan it on a drum scanner or a flatbed that's higher, much higher resolution. But so I thought I would jump in with a it's a photo I took on my Leica 35mm in Southend, and it's going to give you a quick idea of what you can do. So I'm going to use Lightroom, but Photoshop is pretty much exactly the same as if you open a photo in Photoshop. If you just go to filters at the top and then camera raw filter, it's exactly the same interface as editing a photo on Lightroom. So don't worry if you don't have Lightroom, just go to camera raw on Photoshop and it's exactly the same. So I'm just going to share my screen and we can jump in to this one. Right. Let me see. Can somebody just type so they can see that? Oh. Yeah, great, perfect, cool. So, right, so this is Southend. So this is a scan I did at home. And as you can see, it's fairly dull. There's not a lot, but it's a base scan. So I'm just looking for, when I'm making a scan, I'm looking for a nice, even color palette, essentially. I don't want to have any casts of greens or overly blue. You don't want any defects, or I don't personally want any defects in my film. I want it to look how it looked at the time. Again, stylistic choice. You do you. Edit your film. Like, always edit your film. Don't believe people when they say you can't edit film and you should post it straight from scan. You won't find a single photographer that's worth a salt that shoots film and doesn't edit it. If you think Ansel Adams is probably the most famous film photographer that edited, and you look at all Ansel Adams landscapes and they are heavily photoshopped, and Photoshop and Lightroom are just digital versions of what people used to do in a dark room. So don't believe the haters, edit your film. and I promise you it's absolutely fine, and it's expected, to be honest, because sometimes scans don't look very good. So with this, I'm just going to talk you through what I'm going to do. So first up, compositionally, don't worry too much if you take a photo and you don't like, the composition. You can, if you ever look at contact sheets by old photographers and things like that, you can see how much work people do with like cutting out the bits of the photo that they want. So I'm first up just going to crop this. I'm going to crop this out, fit there. Right, 2 seconds. I'll minimize that. There we go. So I'm going to crop this to 4:5. 4:5 is the same as medium format aspect ratio. Doesn't matter that I didn't shoot it on a medium format camera. No one's going to know. Oh, I think my headphones have just died. Can you all still hear me? Just double. Yeah, cool, great. So I'm going to stick with that for the minute. So what we should really be doing first is we're going to spot it. So spotting is super important with film because you're going to have dust on it. So also definitely when you're scanning, if you ever do, use non-static gloves, because then you won't get dust on it so much and you won't get fingerprints and you can slide it and clean it. Right, so I'm going to open this in Photoshop really quickly. You could just use this, the spot removal thing here, if you're just using Lightroom, but I would always opt for opening it in Photoshop. So let's open it up into Photoshop. Right, let's get rid of this, shall we? Oh no, actually I need that. There we go. So I'm going to use this plaster tool here, and this is just going to spot it. So you can see there's some dust. I'm not going to go through and do all of it because it will take a while, because you should spend time doing this. And I'm just getting rid of these dust things. If you use the bracket tool, it'll make your things smaller and larger. So you've just got to be patient with it. Another really good tip is if you have a straight line like this, if you hold Shift, click the first one, click it once, press Shift, and then go to the other end, and then hold Shift, it'll do a straight line. So you don't have to kind of get a perfect straight line as you're doing it. So I'm just going to clean this up, kind of make sure there's no, I mean, it's going to be loads of dust all over this probably now. But that's the major ones. This one is a scanning thing, so I'd have to try and get rid of that roughly. Obviously, I would spend much longer doing this normally. Let's get rid of that as well. All right, so let's file save. It's gonna jump straight back up into Photoshop with the edited one. There it is. Right, perfect. So first up, I'm gonna up the exposure. So you can see, just to give you an idea of what dynamic range is like on film. You can see how much information is held here. It's mad. And how much you can really do with it. It blows my mind, still, to be fair. So I'm going to up the exposure. Contrast, avoid contrast. It does nothing good for a photo. It will change the color completely. I know that it makes everything look much like punchier, but it does nothing good for your photo, to be honest. So instead of that, use dehaze, and I'll get to that in a second. So with the highlights, going to pull down the highlights a little bit. Again, just mess with your faders till you get an idea of how you're happy it's looking. I'm actually going to, after doing that, I'm going to punch them about there. Shadows are pretty good. I'm going to sort this out afterwards. And then I'm going to pull the blacks down a bit. Dehaze. So dehaze, what I say is better than contrast. It does what you want contrast to do, but it doesn't mess with it too much. It just makes everything a bit crunchier. So I'm going to go with that. So your tone curve, so this is your highlights. So if I pull this up, your highlights are going to jump up, right? And this is your dark. So I'm going to do a classic little S curve here. There we go. And then I want my blue. So this is really good. So hue, that's just changing the colors. Essentially, if I want to change the way the blue looks, see, I can change it like that. You can go as mad as you want.
I'm going to make it a little bit more turquoisey, and then luminance, I'm going to pull down so I can make that blue a bit darker, a bit richer. And then I'm going to pump the saturation of it a little bit. I'm going to do the same with some of these other colors, just to kind of get them a bit more accurate. Film doesn't always perfectly render the scene as it was at the time. So just mess around with it until you're happy with it. So I want that to be a bit more red. As you can see, it's a bit pink at the moment. That's not how it was. So I'm going to render it a bit more red. Down. That's pretty good. So this is my favorite tool in Lightroom, and nobody realizes it's there. So this is color grading. And essentially what I'm doing here is I'm adding, so I choose a hue. This is the midtones. So it'll be this whole area here, probably. I'm going to bump up saturation. You can see that it's added a color cast over it, right? So it's not going to look this ridiculous, but I want it to be warmer. So I'm going to get to a point where that's looking pretty nice and warm. And I'm going to pull this all the way back down, and I'm going to add it in slowly until I'm happy with it. I'm going to do this for the shadows as well. Same thing. Add a nice bit of warmth to the shadows. Perfect. Sharpening, really important. So this is one of the best tips that I ever found out. So with sharpening, let's take it to about 100, let's say. And then if you press masking, and Alt, the Alt key, it'll show you what you're going to mask. So I'm pressing the Alt key there, holding it down. And then if you slide it along, it shows you everything that's going to be sharpened. So I'm going to put it about here. That's looking pretty good. Okay. All right, so I'll give you a little before and after. If we, let's say, so that can, you can really see how much you can do with that. It's pretty mad, to be honest. Just making sure you're cleaning everything up. But you can save almost anything. To give you a couple of more examples of before and afters. There's a film and this photo on the same day. This is what it looked like before. Just a regular scan. This is why you shouldn't always just post your scans as they are, because sometimes they don't look very good. But it's half the fun of taking photos is can't see before and after now. There you go. There we go. Right, I've got another example. Where is it? Here again. So, is it loading? Asking it to do too much. There we go. See, so I overexposed that to be safe. And because of that, as a negative, it doesn't really look anything like I took it. So I added then a shed load of warmth to it. So be creative with it. Don't get stuck thinking that, you can't make all these changes and you should just post them how they are. If you don't have Lightroom, that's fair enough. Or Photoshop, but I definitely advise getting it, and it'll what's the best way of explaining it? It's one of those things that's practice. So when you take a photo, it's always good to think as you're doing it, how I want this photo to look at the end. So it's sometimes that'll come down to lighting and all those sort of things, but having an idea of how you want it to look will make the end process so much easier to achieve. So I knew with this photo that it's really nice and warm. I want that kind of autumnal vibe with this. I want the hard shadows and the contrast between the two sides of the building here. And this is how I ended up with it. I've also got a big thing with light and shade. So with this is what I mean by the the metering stuff is that obviously this scene is quite difficult to meter. So I could meter for the highlights or I could meter for the shadows here. But I knew that I wanted this contrast between the two. So I metered for there and I metered for here. And then I averaged the two of them out. And that's what I mean by having an understanding of how you want something to look at the end as you're shooting it. And then you can kind of fix and change things as you're going along at the end. Just trying to think. I know that time is ticking on. While the other one more example of editing something that could be quite good. All right, here's a good one. So I made a Microsoft background. It's one of the most expensive photos ever sold, so I thought maybe I'll give it a go. So before, it looked like this. And all it took was some adjustments in the color to kind of get it to the point where it was bright and punchy again. So to give you a quick, I'll show you how easy this can be done. So here's your frame lines at the top from the negative. Gosh, like that. Again, I kind of do the same thing every time. DEA is up. Once you get used to it, you just kind of get into the flow of it. Practice. Oh, I don't want those greens. I want that green to be nice and punchy, but not yellow. It's quite often green. So you can see how much what I thought was green was really yellow. So just adjusting things until you're happy with it. This bit down here is quite red and orange. So I can adjust that to get a bit more contrast. Pull luminance down to get a bit more blue. You've got so much you can do with it. It'd be such a shame to take photos and, not have a bit of fun with it. So if you see, obviously it's not clean at all, but it really doesn't take much time to, to go through like that. Are there any questions regarding any of this kind of Photoshop stuff? People don't like asking questions, but I know when I started out, there was quite a lot of stuff which I would have found before people were doing this all on YouTube. I guess everyone's got a lot at disposal now. So what I would say is to anybody that's starting into this is it's obviously expensive to get into because it costs a lot of money to buy film, but just shoot, practice. Don't worry about making money from it. Don't worry. I get a lot of people asking me on Instagram how they can make money from it. I've only just started selling prints and things like that and making zines. I kind of built up to that, and as far as kind of coming up with like style and things like that, just let it happen naturally. There are plenty of people, photographers and things that you can look at. There's outfit payment. There is an online app for people who may not be able to pay called Photo. Sweet. They all generally do the same thing, to be honest. It's definitely a good investment. So with phones, I would try and get into the habit of editing on a laptop. It's hard to kind of have as much control, especially as like cleaning up negatives and things like that when you're doing it on a phone. But that, as however you want to do it, really. For the first 5 years of me shooting, I just posted everything as they were scanned. So there is no rules to it. Do what you need to do. I think I'm almost at what's the most challenging photo you've ever had previously? Almost. Let me see. Hold on. I might be able to show you that. It was here. Where is it? Dum, 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 dum. This one. So this is a good example of a fast shutter speed. This was really hard to edit because half the sky is blue, but it's really golden. So trying to get that balance as far as like scanning is concerned and editing afterwards is really hard to get that balance. And I only took one photo, so this is the only photo of that scene. So that was really hard. That was really hard. Yeah. Good question though. Right. Cool. Right, I'm gonna slip off sharing. There we go. Any more questions at all? Anything you like? So I obviously, if you ever wanted, if you do want to check out my Instagram and things like that, and I quite often do editing tutorial things like reels and stuff like that, explaining how I've kind of started a photo and ended a photo. So be sure to check that out. Joe W. Howard. That's it. Who's my favorite photographer of all time? My favorite photographer of all time is Harry Greer. I'll show you a book of his. Hold on. He is a Belgian photographer, primarily color, and he does. I'll show you some of his photos. His color photos are unbelievable. He shoots for Magnum. That's one of his photos. He's amazing. That's how you spell his name. It's obviously backwards. Hold on, I'll type it out. It's easier, isn't it? Yeah, so my contact details are Joe Howard on Instagram. So just DM me. I'm happy to take a look at anyone's photos, and not that I'm in the kind of, I talk the gospel. I'll give my opinion on it and hopefully any constructive criticism, but also yeah, just get in touch for sure. Do you scan directly onto a scanner? Yeah, so I use a slide holder. So that's 35mm one and slides. I found that a lot of people have had hard times using these, but I've never had an issue because they don't quite get flat enough. But I think if you press your negatives properly in the beginning, I've never had an issue. So yeah, definitely scanning at home is super useful, and it's a really good practice to have and learn. Any more questions? If not, then I guess we can wrap it up. No, cool. All right, well, I hope that was useful. I know I kind of thundered through, but yeah, be sure to message if you want any other info or anything like that. And on Instagram, there's plenty of useful photographers that are willing to help. But just go out and shoot every day, as much as you can. Always have a camera. Always have a camera. Anyway, have a lovely evening. It's lovely to look at all your names on a screen. Peace.